Hi, Hannah.
Hi. Hi, Samantha.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat.
So tell us a little bit about you. Where are you from? Where do you live?
Yeah, so I'm talking to you from Boston, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. I've been here, all 30 years of my life, even through college. And as the way that we got connected, so I live with type 1 diabetes, which I'm sure we'll get into, and run an Instagram account called Type Foodie. So lots of baking sort of in my outside of my day life, and has been so exciting to build a community online, both with diabetics and some people with, no or little connection to the diabetes community too, the original recipes.
Yes, I love it. And it's crazy you're in Boston. I've never actually been to Boston. It's one of those places that's like on my
Yes.
I just have never been.
Okay, well, now this will be your sign to come to Boston. I will welcome you with a box of, I have my big boxes of baked goods. So
Perfect.
ready
Yeah.
for you.
Now I have a reason to come. That's great. Yeah, yeah. So we connected over Instagram because I've been following your account for a very, very long time. And I'm like, okay, wait, I need to actually talk to her and like learn about this.
Totally.
Okay, well, first,
Totally.
tell us your type 1 diagnosis story.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm 30 now. I was diagnosed at around 12 years old. So I've been diabetic for, almost 18 years or just about. I was diagnosed on Halloween, which I always like love to share. And I don't have the best memory in general, but I do remember, from my childhood certain moments. And I will never forget my mom being on the phone. And of course, like it's the day of Halloween where it's centered around candy. And I just remember asking my mom, like, am I going to be able to eat candy? And she's like, but first, my dad has type 1 diabetes as well. So he was diagnosed later on in life. So as you can imagine, he had kind of a difficult diagnosis where they assumed that he had type 2 because of his age. So I was very grateful. I didn't know at the time how lucky I was to have someone in my family with type 1 diabetes. And I feel now that has been a huge piece of this online community too, even just like having people to talk to type 1 or really, any type of diabetes. At 12, I was in, what we call sort of like the honeymoon phase. And so I think at first, I took long acting insulin only. And then, as time went on, I was on pens mostly, was on a pump at one point during college. So, unfortunately, that's a little while ago. So now, and it was sort of earlier on in, that technology, I think in the past like 10 years or so, it's like, we couldn't even imagine right where we are now. So I actually switched of a pump, and right now I'm on multiple daily injections. It feels like forever, but it definitely hasn't been maybe 6 years or so.
Okay, so I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, please, please.
I'm curious, how old was your dad when he was diagnosed?
So I'm thinking that, this goes back to my bad memory. I want to say maybe in his like either late 30s or early 40s. So he was like full on adult, had, two children already. I want to say it was in, now that I say that out loud, probably in his early 40s, because I was definitely alive when he got diagnosed. So, they assumed he had type 2. He went through however, this is not to, out his age, but 20 plus years ago. So they told him he needed to lose weight. He did that. And of course, first of all, that's not maybe the best, advice, but they did that. And then he was, of course, that didn't make a difference, right? Because he, had type 1. And of course, as we know, there's so much more that goes into that anyways, regardless of what type. But and so luckily he actually found, I don't know who his doctor was at first, but he found a wonderful endocrinologist. I mean, he, as you can imagine, even getting diagnosed at 12, it's such a huge difference. I think about that a lot. There are kids, of course, who are diagnosed at 2 or younger. I cannot imagine what parents go through in that case. At 12, you're already sort of used to ways of life, but you're still young and, can adjust. But I think, not to speak for my dad, but being in your early 40s and going through that sort of like transition, I can't imagine. And so, it's still, I see it still him getting used to like the technology, and he's on his Dexcom too. So we're both discussing the possibility of going on a pump. We were do it together.
That is really nice that you had each other. I mean, obviously it's terrible you both have it, but it's
Yes.
great that you both
Of course.
can talk about it because and there's no one in my family that has it. And so every time I bring it up, and I was diagnosed as an adult
Yeah.
too, so my
Okay. I was
parents,
going to ask. Okay.
yeah, I was diagnosed at 29. Yeah, and so
Yeah.
my parents were never involved. And so when I go home to see them,
Oh,
they have
interesting.
no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
So it is weird. It's like it would be nice to have somebody in your family that understands.
It's it is, and I mean, I think even little things. It's like I'm very lucky. I love my parents, and I'm glad they're both in good health and around. And but even just little things. It's like my mom will get frustrated with my dad, and then I can sort of talk to her and say, hey, listen, like I get frustrated. But it's hard to hear some of that stuff from someone who's not living with diabetes. So even that sort of dynamic, and I have a sister too who I must mention as well, my older sister. So it's been interesting seeing sort of through her eyes and my mom's eyes, sort of living with, someone with diabetes too. So
Yeah, well, I mean, I was for most of my life did not have
yeah,
type 1. And so
right.
it's interesting to be like, "Oh my gosh, like I had no idea what these people like with have type 1 go through." But
Totally.
it's just I don't know, it's wild. I wish more people knew about it and understood, but unfortunately you just don't understand unless you have it.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a friend right now who was diagnosed with gestational diabetes, and it's been so interesting. I mean, there are things, like I said, I've been diabetic for about 18 years, and seeing her go through, I'm like still learning stuff from her. For example, I can't remember the name of it, but there was an insulin that she's on. I only know, short acting and long acting. Apparently, there's one in the middle if you have gestational diabetes, or maybe it's used for other types. And so it's so interesting too. It's like even when you live with diabetes, there's just always so much more to learn, which is sort of the blessing and curse of diabetes, I think, right? It's always changing and there's always new stuff, which is great and complicated and messy. And
So what pump were you on before?
so I was on the Omnipod, and so again like, trying to do this math. Clearly, I need to write this down. I want to say it was probably at this point maybe 10 years ago or so. So it was like an early
Mhm.
generation, and I think the biggest difference, honestly, at the time is I wasn't on a Dexcom. So for me, being on pump and being in college and not having a continuous glucose monitor was like, impossible. CGMs weren't really a thing. I didn't understand at the time that like how much of a difference that would have made. But I had in college, I went to the hospital. I had a seizure from low blood sugar because there was no communication between my pump and anything that could tell my blood sugar, and I was asleep. Luckily, I had a great roommate at the time and was completely fine. But it's scary to think, right? Like obviously there are plenty of people if had they not access to a CGM, and of course, like not to mention that that's still a huge issue now. It's just the technology is so different now having that interaction. So however many years ago, got the CGM, and of course it was an early generation. It wasn't worth it. And I think a huge thing that at least myself and I imagine a lot of other people with diabetes deal with is just like having control over what you can, right? So for me with the pump, it was an awesome tool, but I just wanted to be able to have control over the insulin I was getting and be able to sort of be in that mindset. So I've been back on multiple daily injections like 10 since then. So, for the past 10 years or so.
I'm on MDI too, and I honestly
Okay.
I love it.
Me too.
I get like the benefits of a pump. Like when people bring it up to me, I'm like, oh, that would be
Totally.
nice. But then I'm like, but I
Totally.
just love I love not having like a bunch of stuff. Like I love just carrying a pump
Yeah.
and being done with it.
100%. 100%. I always joke it's like I'm totally like a handbag gal. So it works well, right? Because we always have to have our stuff with us. But it is like, and I think I've noticed this over the years. I have been able to reduce the size of my handbag, the amount of things that you have to have with you as backup. It's a lot. And so it is sort of a shift, right? To think about like having some extra stuff with you. But I think if I were to go on a pump at some point, and I will consider it, it would probably be the Omnipod again because I like the tubeless.
There's a lot of people actually still on MDI. I talk to a lot of people that just love it. And then if there's some people that
Yeah,
hate it and they want to be on a pump. So I'm like, I'm so glad we have the options for people.
totally, totally. I mean, honestly, really the only time, I shouldn't say the only time, but really the most common time that I think of it is if I'm at like an event or I'm at somewhere where it's like standing, like I'm at like a cocktail party for a wedding or something, and those are the moments where I think to myself, would be cool to be able to pull out the piece of machinery and like give myself insulin. I'm very like I will inject myself anywhere, but still, right? Like to be able to just like press a button when you're in an event. Those are the times I think about it. But as someone who loves to like be home and watch TV, it doesn't come up as often. So we'll see.
I always think about it in the winter too when you're like bundled
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
And I'm like, oh no, where do I inject?
Like literally, where do I go? Yeah,
That's the other time when I'm like,
exactly.
oh, this would be nice to just put it in my phone
Right.
or whatever. But
Totally. Totally.
otherwise, it's good. And I was going to say I
Yeah.
feel blessed because I was actually right when I was diagnosed, I was given a CGM. So I've never really had to
So
like only
interesting.
rely on pricking my finger. So
Yeah, yeah. I honestly it's like I can't imagine. And I remember going on to the CGM, I was so against it. I really had no interest in it. And again, it was like, it is nice, right? Like going through this stuff with my dad too and saying, all right, like you're doing this, I can do it too. And let's just like see, and we can always go back, right? And I remember a time, when the warm up period used to be longer and it was like the best for those, 2 hour break. And then now it's like, I'm so thankful I'm on the G7. I'm so thankful it's only 30 minutes. I feel like I don't know what I'm doing without it. I'm still sort of in tune with my body enough to I'm very lucky that I can still generally feel when my blood sugar is dropping or if it's high, but I rely on it so much now that I can barely remember not having it. So
how do you like the G7? I'm still on G6.
the G6. So I love it. I will say, and it's such a hard thing to remember every time. So if you do make the switch, just know that the first 2 weeks are going to be terrible. Like you're going to be like, what is this? It feels like even though it is so similar in a good way and so familiar, it is going to feel like you're, using a new piece of technology, which is exactly what you're doing. And I think that is the biggest piece that I always forget after 2 weeks and learning how to put the new sensors on. Like I love it. I feel like again, the 30-minute warm up for me is like huge. If I'm getting ready in the morning and I realize, oh my gosh, I have to switch it, and to know that it'll be working again in 30 minutes. And then there's a 12-hour grace period, which I didn't know how much I would love that. So imagine your CGM rather expires at 10 p.m. I mean, I'm sure you experience this now. Okay, well now if I put on a new one, it's not going to work for 2 hours. It's going to be midnight. It might not work exactly perfectly when it goes on. It's going to wake me up maybe with a false low or something like that. Now it expires at 10 p.m. I'll just put a new one on in the morning and it'll work. It'll work throughout the night. So that's been like my biggest, that and a 30-minute warm up period.
That, that's
Very
very
nice.
nice. Yes.
So you have to keep me updated if you make the switch.
I've heard people complaining about it falling off easier because the adhesive is smaller.
It's small. So it's funny. I noticed, and again, like I had a feeling because they started providing an overpatch with every sensor. So I was like, okay, this is, and I just went on it maybe a few months ago. So like people have been on it for a while. So I don't know if they had been doing that from the beginning, but I have a feeling maybe they got that feedback. I haven't had that experience. I did in the beginning, and I can't even tell you. I'm not doing anything differently. I don't know. Maybe my body somehow got used to it, right? And it's sticking on, but at least like they send the over patches. And then I've been getting, I wish I could remember off the top of my head. I'll send it to you after, but I order like over patches that are like a little cuter elsewhere too. And so usually what I do is I put it on, wait like 3 days, and then I put the over patch on. That way the over patch only has to work for like 7 days. They will replace if they fall off. Like I always submit a ticket and they're pretty good at replacing it.
Someone's actually really good at that. Like if something happens, they're
Yeah.
pretty good at replacing it.
And that has like, I'm laughing. I'm like, this is not sponsored, obviously, but that has improved greatly. They've always been good about replacing, but even just like the speed of their customer service, and that makes like a world of difference. Because when you're in that moment, frustrated, like that can be make or break. So that has been just like a really nice shift too, like over the years.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Okay, so let's dive into your Instagram page
Yeah.
because I want to hear all about it. So when did you start?
Yeah.
Tell us about it and then when did you start it?
Yeah, so I started it just over, I want to say 3 years ago, which is wild to me. Like, I feel like I've both been doing it forever and for like a day. So I've always baked, like I've always enjoyed baking. As I mentioned with my diagnosis story, I'm obviously someone who loves sweets and candy, and that has not changed since I was a little kid. And so during COVID, I think a lot of us have this sort of like origin story from the pandemic. I was home, I was working remotely, and was at a job where I had sort of a lot of time. It was a very, classic. It didn't sort of breach into my personal hours, and I am someone who likes to stay very, very busy and occupied. And so I found myself baking a lot. I feel like a lot of people did sort of during pandemic. And I had been thinking too, I ran an Instagram previously with my best friend where we would post about restaurants. And of course, we were home. And I started to think about like when I got diagnosed, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, right? When you get diagnosed with diabetes, often you're told, cook your meals at home. It's so much easier. You'll know what's in your food. That was not my experience, right? Like I'm at home cooking. If you're like a creative cook, you're using all these different ingredients, and it's like, what am I going to do? Sit with an Excel document every time I cook dinner? I obviously don't do that. So it's a little trial and error. You try and do some rough math. And I started to think about baking, and I was like, the beauty of baking, which I think some people have trouble with, is this like exact science of it, right? It's like when we're making pasta, like there's so much variety that like everyone has their sort of flavor to it. But if I'm making a cookie recipe, there's no reason I can't provide specific carb details. So I started using, I was baking for a bunch of, other recipes that I relied on, and I would look at the nutrition facts that are shared on their site. I think, a couple of things stood out to me. One, I have no desire to know how many calories or, other things are sort of in my baked goods. Like that is not why I'm baking. And I firmly believe that like I can enjoy all types of food, whether it's like I would say I'm chickpea obsessed too. I have lots of chickpeas and veggies, and I also have lots of cookies. And I don't need to know how many calories are in either of those. So I think that was something that stood out to me is, I'm baking, and now I'm having to, just like with every snack that we're always having to look at the nutrition facts. I don't want this to be a place where I have to do that. And then the other piece was it wasn't written in a way that like helped me be able to dose correctly. So they would give the carb count, but I didn't know maybe like what exact chocolate they're using, or it didn't tell me how many carbs were coming from the chocolate, for example. Because I started to think about this, I was like, there's something here. And so now I do the work in my, Google sheet. So I do have the Excel sheet where I'm doing these calculations. And so in every, one of my recipes, like there will be never ever be calorie information, but at the bottom, there will be a breakdown of carb details for the whole recipe by, so we'll take cookies, for example. It'll show you the carb count for the entire recipe. What if, mine made a dozen, but for whatever reason yours made 14. And then for, the recommended number of cookies or whatever, so you don't have to do the math. And then also, for example, something like a chocolate chip cookie, I'll tell you how many carbs come from the chocolate in the cookie, because what if you use a different type of chocolate or something from me? And I like could not have anticipated, like I was so uninvolved in any online diabetes community. So it has just been like awesome finding other people who enjoy baking, live with diabetes, know someone who has diabetes, or just like love cookies. And it's been just awesome.
You have a ton of followers. I mean, for just that short amount of time, like 3 years, that's a lot of people. Like, was that just organic?
Yeah. So it's been totally organic. So I mentioned I had, I work in communications in my day job, and I've run an Instagram through it before with my best friend, and our account lives on. We just don't we don't post to it. But so I had some sort of experience there. But it has been organic. I mean, I think the biggest thing with social media is it's this fine balance between like jumping on trends. You don't want to do that if it doesn't sort of fit with what you stand for, or what you do, but also finding opportunity to sort of like get your content in front of people. So I think when I started a couple of years ago, reels were new and they were taking off, and so that was like a huge part of my growth is posting videos. I was laughing with my husband the other day. I was like looking at videos that I posted like 3 years ago, and I was like, this does not look like the same person. I hope no one scrolls back. But it's like trial and error, right? It's just like diabetes. It's sort of like you figure out what works, and then like what works today also might not work like tomorrow or 2 weeks from now or 6 months from now. And sort of just like keeping an eye on that, seeing what's working, seeing what people are responding to. And, people love baked goods and just like I do, which is awesome. So,
Yeah, that is amazing. I was looking at some of your recipes just before this, and I was like, these look
yeah.
so good. And I was gonna say, I also
Thank you.
love that you don't remove the sugar. Like you are all
Yeah.
about eating it as it should be.
Yeah, I mean, I always say like my biggest thing is like I will add the amount of sugar or sweetness that we need, right? Like I'm certainly not going to like cut out sugar because I think what people forget too is like it impacts the texture, right? So I am all for like, again, I said I love chickpeas. I eat a lot of bonza. Like if I go out, like I will be eating fresh pasta at home. Like I like to think my cooking is good, but it's, I'm no chef. So like it's okay, right? If we have like a whole wheat pasta or a bonza, I still enjoy it. If I have a brownie that has fake sugar or it doesn't have the right amount of sugar, like I'm not going to enjoy it and I'm going to just wind up reaching for a real brownie an hour from now. And so if I know how many carbs are in this cookie, that's great. I can pre-bolus like the right amount of time and selfishly like has been the best piece of it. I feel like I have so much more knowledge about even if I get a cookie out of the house, if I buy it from a bakery or something, I won't be able to guess exactly, but around 30 carbs, like I can get there like a little bit closer. So that has actually been like really nice.
It is so true. I feel like when I eat like a baked good, I'm always like, I have no idea. And I'm literally
No
just
clue.
guessing out of the blue. Like, so that is super nice
Totally.
to have an idea.
Totally. And it's so interesting, right? Like people, I do not as much anymore. I feel like I've like found my people, right? On Instagram, hopefully. But I'll get comments that say, this doesn't really look diabetes friendly or diabetic friendly. And, I have had some actually like good conversations. My husband is always like, why do you respond to these? And on the off chance that someone is like ready to listen, right? It's like any food can be, diabetes friendly. It's just everyone's different, right? And I think there's nothing wrong. There are so many people who find joy in swapping, in something like, Splenda or another sort of like sugar. I love finding recipes like that where they're maybe a little bit lower in carb naturally, maybe not with dessert, but for my savory foods or whatever, if it works, I think that's great. But for the people who don't want that, like I'm glad that I found those people too.
Yeah, and you're totally right. I feel like some days I'm like, oh, I will add monk fruit, but then other days I'm
Yeah,
like, I want
totally.
sugar. So
And there's nothing wrong with that.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's great to have
totally.
options. So
Totally.
do you have a favorite dessert that you've ever created?
I do. It's so funny. Like, so I think the easy answer, and it really is the truth, like my favorite recipe of all time is my brown butter chocolate chip cookies. So anytime someone asks me like where to start, that is always where I'll tell them. Another sort of like favorite that I often have in my freezer, like I always have that dough in my freezer. That's my other secret is like freeze your dough. And then like if you want a cookie, you can just bake one. I like do not believe in next day cookies. Brownies also freeze very well, and my cookie dough brownies are like my favorite. I always have them in the freezer. They're the best. So, and I will tell you too, like if you ever have any baking questions, like I'm a DM away. I have all my sister, my friends, like anytime they're baking one of my recipes, I'm like there live for them. Hopefully there's enough info in there for you, but sometimes it can be stressful. So
Yeah, I
I'm
was like,
here when you decide on the first recipe.
I say these sound so good. I'm going to like go to the store later and probably buy some of
I love it. I love it.
them. So I'm just curious, do you have like any tips for people that want to eat sugar desserts that have type 1, but they don't know
Yeah.
where to start?
Yeah, I will share obviously what works for me. I think with the caveat, like I said, right? I think this is like the underlying theme is like everyone's different. But I think if you're interested in it, and this is I experience this most. I'm a huge donut person. I love croissants. I love going to bakeries and trying those things. The thing that I found works for me, especially if I'm going to a place where I've never been there, or maybe it's some new flavor, I've never tried it, is, I take my best guess. There's great information online too. Like find what you can, and I start by eating half. So if I get a donut, I've never been to this place before. I have no idea how my body's going to react. Maybe I haven't had a donut in a while. Like take the insulin you think you're going to need, eat half of it, and see what happens. Worst case, like you way off and it had a lot more sugar, you have time to sort of like adjust, right? Or you overdid it a little bit and you have the other half of the donut. So that has been what's worked for me. And I think just like it's not a complete science, but taking note and then like try it again, in a week or a couple of weeks and sort of see what happens and learn from there. It's always so hard, right? Because it's like, did I have enough water today? Like, was I super active? There are all these other sort of factors. But I think that's my number one is like start with half dose to the best of your knowledge and sort of go.
That is a great tip. So how do people find your Instagram and how do they get in touch with you?
I am always like I said, right, like open for comments. I think like my favorite part of this is like if someone makes my recipe and sort of them either DMing me a question or like letting me know they enjoyed it or I am always also like I don't like to tweak my recipes if we don't have to. It was a really big I updated my brown butter chocolate chip cookie recipe. It was like the smallest update. It took me that was my first cookie recipe. I have obviously learned a lot just in developing recipes. And so there was a small change I made. So I do not make adjustments lightly, but I do like take people's feedback. So I think that's been a big piece of it too, is like I'm always, responding to comments and I love when people send me pictures. So of what they baked or maybe it didn't turn out exactly right and I can try and help where I can, but I think that's been a huge piece of it is just like community building and people sharing recipes too with their loved ones.
That's amazing. I love it. And it's at Type Foodie, right?
Yes, type foodie. Yeah.
Okay. Are you only on
Yeah, I know.
Instagram or also?
So I'm on Instagram. I have a TikTok. I'm like trying to, but like I said, right, it's like jumping on those trends that like fit or don't fit with you. I have it and I'm getting there. And then I have my website. So I think that's another question I often get is like, where can I find the full recipe or why don't you share it on Instagram? One, obviously, big piece of it is I want to make sure I can share the carb details, which are always at the bottom. So for those who don't care about it, don't need to know, you can ignore it. And I give like very detailed instructions. I want like the thing too is right. Like I want people to get the best cookie they can, or the best brownie they can, or the best cake. And so that's the best place to get the full recipes. But if it's an easy one, every so often I'll share a full recipe on Instagram if it's something super simple.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. I love it. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was so nice chatting with you and getting to meet you, virtually.
Yes, of course. And I'll include your links below so people can go find you.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. All right. Thank you.